The Commonwealth versus Lizzie Borden, a dramatic reading of the full trial transcript. Day 2, Tuesday, June 6, 1893, New Bedford, Massachusetts. The court came in at 9 o'clock. The jurors and the prisoner answered to the calling of their names. Chief Justice Mason and Justices Blodgett and Dewey presided. The state was represented by Honorable Hosea M. Knowlton, District Attorney for the Southern District, and William H. Moody, Esquire, District Attorney for the Eastern District. The defendant, Miss Borden, was represented by Honorable George D. Robinson, Honorable Andrew J. Jennings, and Melvin O. Adams, Esquire.
At the Superior Court, begun and holden at Taunton, within and for said county of Bristol, on the first Monday of November in the year of our Lord 1892. The jurors for the said Commonwealth, on their oath, present that Lizzie Andrew Borden of Fall River in the county of Bristol, at Fall River in the county of Bristol, on the 4th day of August, in the year 1892, in and upon one Abby Durfee Borden, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, an assault did make, and with a certain instrument, to wit, a sharp cutting instrument, the name and a more particular description of which is to the jurors unknown, her, the said Abby Durfee Borden, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, did strike, cut, beat, and bruise in upon the head of her, the said Abby Durfee Borden, giving to her, the said Abby Durfee Borden, by the said striking, cutting, beating, and bruising, in and upon the head of her, the said Abby Durfee Borden, then and there instantly died. And so the jurors aforesaid, upon their oath aforesaid, do say that the said Lizzie Andrew Borden, the said Abby Durfee Borden, in manner and for aforesaid then and there, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, did kill and murder, against the peace of said Commonwealth, and contrary to the form of statute in such case made and provided. The jurors for the said Commonwealth, on their oath, present that Lizzie Andrew Borden, of Fall River in the county of Bristol, at Fall River in the county of Bristol, on the 4th day of August, in the year 1892, in and upon one Andrew Jackson Borden, feloniously, wilfully, and of her own malice aforethought an assault did make, and with a certain instrument, to wit, a sharp cutting instrument, the name and a more particular description of which is to the jurors unknown, him, the said Andrew Jackson Borden, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought did strike, cut, beat, and bruise in upon the head of him, the said Andrew Jackson Borden, giving to him, the said Andrew Jackson Borden, by the same striking, cutting, beating, and bruising, in and upon the head of him, the same Andrew Jackson Borden, then and there instantly died. And so the jurors aforesaid, upon their oath aforesaid, do say that the said Lizzie Andrew Borden, the said Andrew Jackson Borden, in manner and for aforesaid, then and there, feloniously, wilfully, and of her malice aforethought, did kill and murder, against the peace of said Commonwealth, and contrary to the form of statute in such case made and provided. A true bill. Henry A. Bodman, Foreman of the Grand Jury. Hosea M. Knowlton, District Attorney. Gentlemen of the jury, hearken unto an indictment found against the prisoner at the bar by the grand inquest of this county. On this 2nd day of December, in the year 1892, this indictment was returned and presented to said Superior Court by the grand jury, ordered to be filed, and was further ordered by the court that notice given to said Lizzie Andrew Borden, that said indictment will be entered forthwith upon the docket of the Superior Court in said county. To each count of which indictment Lizzie Andrew Borden, the prisoner at the bar, has heretofore pleaded and said that thereof she is not guilty, and for trial puts herself upon her country, which country you are. You are now sworn to try the issue. If she is guilty on either or both of said counts, You are to say so, and if she is not guilty on either or both of said counts, you are to say so, and no more. Good men and true, stand together and hearken to your evidence.
William H. Moody, District Attorney for Essex County, begins the opening statement for the Commonwealth.
May it please your honors, Mr. Foreman, gentlemen of the jury. Upon the 4th day of August last year, an old man and woman, husband and wife, each without a known enemy in the world, in their own home upon a frequented street in the most populous city in this county, under the light of day, and in the midst of its activities, were first one, and then, after an interval of an hour, another, severally killed by unlawful human agency. Today, a woman of good social position, of hitherto unquestioned character, a member of a Christian church and active in its good works, the own daughter of one of the victims, is at the bar of this court, accused by the grand jury of this county of these crimes. There is no language, gentlemen, at my command, which can better measure the solemn importance of the inquiry for which you are about to begin than this simple statement of fact. For the sake of these crimes, and for the sake of these accusations, every man may well pause at the threshold of this trial and carefully search his understanding and conscience for any vestige of prejudgment, and, finding it, cast it aside as an unclean thing. It is my purpose, gentlemen, and it is my duty to state to you at this time so much of the history of the cause, and so much of the evidence which is to be introduced upon this trial as shall best enable you to understand the claim of the government, and to appreciate the force and application of the testimony as it comes from the witnesses upon the stand. It is my purpose to do that in the plainest, simplest, and most direct manner. And it is not my purpose to weary you with a recital of all the details of evidence which is to come before you. Andrew Jackson Borden, the person named in the second count of the indictment, was at the time of his death a man of considerable property, somewhere, I believe, between $250,000 and $300,000. He had been retired from business for a number of years. He was a man who had obtained his fortune by earning and saving, and he retained the habit of saving up to the time of his death. And it will appear in the course of this trial that the family establishment was upon what might well be called, for a person in his circumstances, a narrow scale. He had been twice married. The first wife died some 27 or 28 years before he did, leaving 2 children now alive. The prisoner at the bar, Lizzie Andrew Borden, the youngest, and then somewhere between 2 and 3 years of age, and a sister, Miss Emma Borden, being a woman at the present time in the neighborhood of 10 years older than the prisoner. Not long after the death of his first wife, Andrew Borden married again a woman whose maiden name, I believe, was Abby Durfee Gray. The marriage, I believe, was something over 25 years before the time of their deaths, and there was no issue of the second marriage, at least none living and known that I have been informed of at any time. Abby Durfee Borden, at the time of her death, was about 6 years younger than her husband, and that would make her, of course, 64 years of age. Mr. Borden, I may say here, was a spare, thin man and somewhat tall. Mrs. Borden was a short, fat woman, weighing, I believe, in the neighborhood of 200 pounds. The house in which these homicides were committed had been occupied by the Borden family for some 20 years. I shall have occasion to consider its construction and its relation to other buildings and streets later on in the course of this opening. There was, or came to be, between the prisoner and her stepmother, an unkindly feeling. From the nature of the case, from the fact that those who know the most about that feeling, except the prisoner at the bar, are dead, it will be impossible for us at this hearing to get anything more than a suggestive glimpse of that feeling. It will appear that some 5 years before the death of Mr. and Mrs. Borden, some controversy had arrived about some property, not important in itself. Mr. Borden had seen fit to do some benefaction for a relative of Mrs. Borden, and in consequence of that fact, the daughters thought that something should be done for them by the way of a pecuniary provision as an offset. The details of what happened at that time are, as I have said, by no means important. It is significant, however, that enough of the feeling that had been created by the discussion which arose to cause a change in the relations between the prisoner and Mrs. Borden. Up to that point, she had addressed her stepmother as mother. From that time, she substantially ceased to do so. We shall show to you that the spring before these homicides, upon some occasion where a talk arose between the prisoner and a person who did the cloak-making for the family, the latter spoke of Mrs. Borden as mother. The prisoner at once repudiated that relation and said, "Don't call her mother. She's a mean thing, and we hate her. We have as little to do with her as possible." "Well, don't you have your meals with her?" "Yes, we do, sometimes, but we try not to. And a great many times we wait until they are over their meals, and we stay in our own rooms as much as possible." I know nothing that will appear in this case more significant of the feeling that existed between Mrs. Borden and the prisoner than a little incident which occurred not long after the discovery of these homicides. When one of the officers of the law, while the father and stepmother lay at the very place where they had fallen under the blows of the assassin, was seeking information from the prisoner, he said, "When did you last see your mother?" "She is not my mother. She is my stepmother. My mother is dead." You cannot fail, I think, to be impressed in this respect with what will appear as the method of living of this family. It will appear later on in the evidence that, although they occupied the same household, there was built up between them by locks and bolts and bars almost an impassable wall. In the early part of August last year, the older daughter, Miss Emma, was away, I believe at Fairhaven at that time. When Miss Emma was away, the household that was left consisted of Mr. and Mrs. Borden and a servant who had been in the service of the family nearly 3 years, Bridget Sullivan, and the prisoner. Upon the day preceding the homicides, John V. Morse, a brother of Mr. Borden's first wife, and therefore the uncle of his daughters, came upon a visit or a passing visit to the Bordens. These homicides, I may say now, were upon a Thursday, and the visit of Mr. Morse was Wednesday. He came a little after the completion of the dinner, and went away, I think, during the afternoon, and returned in the evening and slept in the house upon the Wednesday night. Upon Tuesday night, August 2nd, an illness occurred in the household. Mr. and Mrs. Borden were taken suddenly ill with a violent retching and vomiting sickness, and it is said to a less degree, the prisoner herself was affected by this illness. Bridget Sullivan was not. Upon Wednesday morning, Mr. and Mrs. Borden rose feeling, of course, in the condition that people would be after a night of that character, and Mrs. Borden consulted a physician with reference to her condition. Upon the noon of Wednesday, which you will keep in mind was the very day before these homicides, the prisoner went to a drugstore in Fall River, the situation of which will be pointed out to you, and there asked the clerk for 10 cents worth of prussic acid for the purpose of cleaning a seal skin cape. She was told that was a poison which was not sold except on the prescription of a physician, and after some little talk went away. I think, gentlemen, that you will be satisfied that there can be no question that the person who made this application for this deadly poison was the prisoner. There were 3 persons in the drugstore, 2 of whom knew her by name and sight. One of these 2 knew her as the daughter of Andrew J. Borden, and the third recognized her at once as he saw her. Upon the evening of Wednesday, the prisoner made a call, not in itself unusual or peculiar, upon a friend of hers, Miss Alice Russell, and we shall commend to your careful attention what occurred during that interview. It will appear that the prisoner had been intending to spend a vacation with a party of her friends at Marion, and had made some arrangement about going to Marion, and the talk between the 2 friends came up upon that topic. The prisoner said, "I have made up my mind, Alice, to take your advice and go to Marion. I have written there to them that I shall go, but I cannot help feeling depressed. I cannot help feeling that something is going to happen to me. I can't shake it off. Last night, she said, we were all sick. Mr. and Mrs. Borden were quite sick and vomited. I did not vomit, and we are afraid that we have been poisoned. The girl did not eat the baker's bread, and we did, and we think it may have been the baker's bread. No, said Miss Russell. If it had been that, some other people would have been sick in the same way. Well, it might have been the milk. Our milk is left outside on the step. What time is your milk left? At 4 o'clock in the morning. It is light then, and no one would dare to come in and do it at that time. Well, said the prisoner, probably that is so. But father has been having so much trouble with those with whom he's had dealings that I am afraid some of them will do something to him. I expect nothing but what the building will be burned down over our heads. The barn has been broken into twice. That, said Mrs. Russell, was merely boys after pigeons. Well, the house has been broken into in broad daylight when Maggie and Emma and I were the only ones in the house. I saw a man the other night as I went home, lurking about the buildings, and as I came he jumped and ran away. Father had trouble with a man the other day about a store. There were angry words, and he turned him out of the house. And so the talk went. That, I beg you to keep in your minds, was Miss Russell, Alice M. Russell. There now comes the most difficult duty which I have in this opening. I am consoled, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen, by the fact that you will be aided beyond any explanation that I give you by a view of these premises that I'm about to explain. I hope that I shall be able, even without the view, to make myself entirely intelligible to you, because no one can understand this testimony that is to come, and rightly reason upon it, without an exact knowledge of the interior and the exterior of that house. In the first place, I may say that the house occupied by this family was a common type house in this community and in this state. A house with the end to the street and the front door upon the end. It had, I believe, no L. It was a rectangular house. It was situated on 2nd Street in Fall River, which is one of the most frequented streets outside the main business streets in the city, and is within, as probably most of you know, a very short distance of City Hall. It may fairly be called a thoroughfare as well, for foot passengers as for carriages. It is a street used partly for residences and partly for business purposes. 2nd Street runs substantially north and south. It is a street which ascends towards the south. The higher part is south, the lower part is north, and upon the east side of 2nd Street this house is situated. At the south of the house is the residence of Dr. Kelly, and also very near to the house. To the north of the house, and also near it, is a residence occupied by Mrs. Churchill, and diagonally in the rear of the house is the residence occupied by Dr. Chagnon. The house is separated from the sidewalk by a wooden fence, a picket fence, with 2 gates, and in the rear of the yard, in which is situated a barn, there is a high board fence, on the top and bottom of which there was at the time, and is, I believe now, a line of barbed wire. There are 3 exterior doors, 3 entrances to the premises, and only 3, excepting, of course, the windows. There is the front door leading directly from the sidewalk up a pair of steps into the hall. There is a side door upon the north side facing Mrs. Churchill's house, leading into a small entryway which leads into the kitchen. There is a third door exactly in the rear of the house which leads down to the cellar. There is what might be called a porch and a door leading into it, as you will see. As you enter the front hall, you enter a hall from which lead 2 doors. A door into a parlor, which is the front room in the house, making the northwest corner of the first story. A door leading into the sitting room, and a stairway leading upstairs. Let us, in the first place, go upstairs and see the arrangement there. It will aid us in considering this arrangement to remember that this house was originally a double tenement house, and with the slight exception that I will refer to later on, the arrangement as it is upstairs is as it is upon the first story. As you are about to see the premises, gentlemen, I do not deem it wise to detain you at the present time by explaining in detail. I will try to make it as clear as I can by stating it to you. As you turn and go upstairs from the front entry, you come into a hallway. From that hallway lead 3 doors. First, a door which leads into a large closet, used at this time for the keeping of the dresses, and which is almost large enough to be a small bedroom. Another door leads into the guest chamber, which is directly over the parlor below, and corresponds to it in every respect. The guest chamber is the chamber in which you will subsequently hear that Mrs. Borden was found dead. It is a matter which is to be carefully considered that as you turn upon the journey upstairs, as the stairs wind about and begin to face the hall toward the north, you can look directly into the door of the guest chamber. The other door which leads from this hall is a door which leads into a bedroom and leads toward the rear of the house. Following then my direction, gentlemen, as you come up the stairs, turn to your left. As you approach the entry, in front of you is a door leading into the guest chamber, and to your right is a door leading into a chamber which at that time was occupied by the prisoner. Between the guest chamber and the bedroom of the prisoner there was a door. I may as well dispose of it now for good. It was a door which always, including the day of this homicide, was kept locked upon both sides, and upon the side toward the prisoner's room there was against the door a desk which she used. In other words, it was not a practicable opening. When you have gotten up into this part of the house, gentlemen, you can go nowhere except into this clothes closet, into this guest chamber, and into the room occupied by the prisoner. It is important to remember that. All access to other parts of the house is cut off, not by the natural construction of the house, but by the way in which the house was kept. Follow me, if you please, then into the prisoner's bedroom. As you enter her bedroom, a door leads to the left into a room which has no other entrance than that door. That is the room that was occupied by Miss Emma when she was at home. The only access to it was through the prisoner's room. There is another door at the rear of the prisoner's room, and directly opposite the door of entrance, which leads into the room occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Borden, which is over the kitchen. The prisoner's room was exactly over the sitting room. The room in the rear of the prisoner's room was exactly over the kitchen, and it was occupied as the bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. That door leading into that room was always kept locked upon both sides. It was locked upon the front towards the prisoner's room by a hook, and it was locked in the rear towards Mr. and Mrs. Borden's room by a bolt. And I may as well say here, as at any time, that the proof that that door was locked upon both sides upon this morning, from the morning down to the time of the arrival of those who came alarmed by this homicide, will be ample and complete. As we go further, passing into the rear of Mr. and Mrs. Borden's room, we find a door, and only a single door, leading out into the entryway, which is over the entryway leading into the kitchen. That door, it will be clearly, amply, and satisfactorily proved, was locked all through this day, up to and beyond the time of the homicide. Now, gentlemen, if I have made myself clear upon this description, which is wearisome, I know, but it is one of the wearisome duties we must undertake in this cause. I have made it clear to you that as you go up the hallway, you get access to but 4 rooms. The hallway itself, if you call that a room, the closet, the guest chamber in which Mrs. Borden was found, and the room of the prisoner, and the room leading out of that, the blind room, so to speak, that was occupied by Miss Emma when she was at home. There is no other access whatever to the rear of the house. Now, gentlemen, let me, at the expense of being tedious, go below. As you enter the hallway below, it is, I believe, exactly as above, except there is no clothes closet there, as there is above. There are 2 small closets, very small ones, as you will see. To your left as you enter is a door which leads into the parlor under the room where Mrs. Borden was found dead. Going straight ahead, you enter into the sitting room, which is a room in the rear of the hall at the south of the house, and directly under and corresponding to the prisoner's bedroom. Now you come to a difference in construction in the 2 stories. You turn to the left from the sitting room as you enter, and you enter the dining room, which is upon the north side of the house, and it is directly under Miss Emma's room, and a large room which was used as a closet by Mr. Borden, and which joined his room, another blind room. That difference is made by either the taking down or the putting up of a partition. You enter the dining room, and there is a door of exit which goes into the kitchen. Above that arrangement is varied by a partition directly down through the room, which would correspond to the dining room. so that above the door corresponding to the door leading from the sitting room to the dining room leads from Miss Emma's room to the bedroom of the prisoner, and the door corresponding to the door leading from the dining room to the kitchen leads from the room which adjoins the blind room, which adjoins the bedroom of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. So the effects of that partition is that while there is free communication two ways from the kitchen to the front part of the house downstairs, upstairs this partition reduces those ways of communication to one. And that one, you will recall, upon the day of the homicide was barred by two doors. Locked. Again, gentlemen, I say the difficulty of understanding this is great, but I am comforted by the fact that you will be aided by a view of these premises. Mr. Morse returned upon a Wednesday night. It is important to show who occupied the house on Wednesday night. Let us first go to the front part of the house. The prisoner came in the last one that night and locked the front door. Upon that front door were three fastenings, a spring latch, a bolt, and a lock, which operated by key. Those three fastenings were closed, by the way, when she came in, the last person that night, by the front way of the house. The door leading into the cellar, the other exterior door, had been closed since Tuesday, the washing day, and by complete and ample evidence will be proved to you to have been closed all through Wednesday night and on Thursday morning, including and beyond the time of these homicides. Bridget came in through the back door that night, found the back door locked when she came, unlocked it, locked it as she went in, went upstairs, and went to bed. So when Bridget and the prisoner had come in at their respective doors, every exterior approach to the house was closed. Now in the front part of the house that night, the prisoner slept in one room, Mr. Morse slept in the guest chamber. There was no other room in that part of the house except Miss Emma's room, which led out, as you remember, of Miss Lizzie's room. Mr. and Mrs. Borden slept in their rooms over the kitchen, and Bridget slept in some room above in the third story of the house. Now then, it becomes my duty to relate in considerable detail all that occurred in that household down to the time of the discovery of these homicides. In the morning, Bridget was the first person up. We may safely assume that, upon the proof that the only human beings who were in the house at that time were Bridget, Mr. and Mrs. Borden, John V. Morse, and the prisoner at the bar. Bridget comes downstairs first, the back way, goes to the cellar, and gets her fuel, builds up the fire in a stove. Then she went to the door, took in the milk, unlocking the door, locked it after she got through. The rear door, I may explain here, was a double door. It was an ordinary wooden paneled door which was used at night, and a screen door which was used, at least in the hot weather, during the time of day, and was fastened only by a hook on the inside. When the outside door was opened by Bridget at that time, it was opened for the good of the day, and the method of security was keeping the screen door locked from that time on. The next person to come down was Mrs. Borden. Bridget came down a little after 6, Mrs. Borden came down a little before 7. Next, Mr. Borden comes down, and after coming down goes out into the yard, empties his slop pail, and unlocks the door to the barn. Bridget saw him do that. Bridget did not see Mr. Morse until they met at breakfast a little after 7. Mr. and Mrs. Borden and Mr. Morse took breakfast together. It will appear what the material of their breakfast was, but it's not important for me to state it at this time. After breakfast, the first one to depart is Mr. Morse. He goes away at 7:15, and Mr. Borden lets him out and locks the screen door behind him. Soon after Mr. Morse went away, the prisoner came downstairs and began eating her breakfast, or what took the place of breakfast, in the kitchen. While she was there, Mr. Borden went upstairs, and while Mr. Borden was upstairs, Bridget went out to the yard because she was sick and desired to vomit. She was gone some moments. Just how long, I cannot tell. When she came back, Mr. Borden had apparently gone downtown. The prisoner was not in the kitchen, and Mrs. Borden was in the dining room dusting. There was some talk then between Mrs. Borden and Bridget about the washing of windows on the inside and outside, and Bridget received the directions from Mrs. Borden to do that service. Mrs. Borden disappeared at this time, and it will appear that she told the prisoner that having made the bed in the spare room, she was going upstairs to put 2 pillowcases upon 2 pillows that were there. A trifling duty, a duty which would take less than a minute. You will be satisfied, gentlemen, that was not far from 9:30, and upon the evidence you will be satisfied that she never left that room alive, and that she was killed within a very few moments after she left that room, because no living person saw Mrs. Borden from that time until her death, except the assailant. In the course of beginning the duty of washing these windows, Bridget had to go to the barn and down to the cellar to get some of the implements for doing the work. As she was at the screen door, about to go out, the prisoner appeared at that back door, and Bridget said, "You needn't lock that door because I'm coming to get my water to wash the windows. But you may," she said, "if you wish, and I will get my water from the barn," as she did. The prisoner said nothing, and I believe it to be the fact, as the evidence will disclose, that the door was not locked at that time. Then Bridget went into the kitchen and dining room and sitting room to close the windows in the sitting room and the dining room, and there was nobody there, neither the prisoner nor Mrs. Borden, who were the only two human beings in the house at that time, except Bridget. In washing these windows, there were two of the sitting room windows upon the south side of the house, which were out of sight of the screen door because they were on the other side of the house. Those two windows were washed first on the outside. Then Bridget came to the front of the house, washed two windows facing the street. Then she came to the north side of the house, the Mrs. Churchill side, and washed the parlor window and the two dining room windows. During all the time that Bridget was washing those windows, she saw neither Mrs. Borden nor the prisoner in any part of the lower part of the house or anywhere else. When she finished washing the windows on the outside, she came in at the screen door and hooked it behind her, and began to wash the windows upon the inside of the same windows that she had washed upon the outside. First she went into the sitting room, which is upon the Kelly side, the south side of the house. She had partly washed one of the two sitting room windows when somebody was heard at the front door. Now, gentlemen, let's pause for a moment and find out as well as we can what time that somebody came to the front door, because it was Mr. Borden. Mr. Borden, it will appear, left the house sometime between 9 and 9:30 o'clock in the morning. He was at two or three banks, between 9:30 and a little after 10 o'clock. At 29 minutes past 10 or at 29 minutes of 11, I'm not sure which, he was at the store of Mr. Clegg, who fixes the exact time. The next place we find him is at another store which belonged to him upon South Main Street near the corner of Spring and not far from his own home. He left there apparently in the direction of his home at 20 minutes of 11. That was about a moment or two's walk from there to his house. The next we see of him is that he is seen by Mrs. Kelly, who lived upon one side of the house and who was going downtown, coming around apparently from the screen door where he had attempted to get in, out upon the sidewalk and towards his own front door, taking out his key to open it. Mrs. Kelly will fix that time at 27 or 28 minutes of 11, which cannot be reconciled with the other time that I have stated here. There will be some explanation of that, and we think you will be satisfied that the clock by which she obtained the time was not one that could be depended on, and that the real fact is that at 20 minutes of 11 Mr. Borden started to his home, which was but a moment or two's walk away. Now then, we fix that as well as we can. When Mr. Borden came home, contrary to the usual custom of the house, Bridget found the front door locked with the key and bolted, as well as secured by the spring lock. Mr. Borden had not rung the bell. He had put his key in and made the noise which people usually do who expect to get into a house by the use of a latch key, but the door was locked and bolted. He came into the house and, as Bridget let him in, made some talk or explanation about the difficulty of unloosening the locks. The prisoner from the hall above made some laugh or exclamation. At that time, gentlemen, Mrs. Borden's body lay within plain view of that hall, dead probably more than an hour. Mr. Borden came in, went first into the dining room. There the prisoner came out and asked him if there was any mail, and said to him, "Mrs. Borden has gone out. She had a note from someone who was sick." That, gentlemen, we put to you as a lie, intended for no purpose except to stifle inquiry into the whereabouts of Mrs. Borden. Mr. Borden then took his key, went upstairs, came down again, and as he came down, Bridget had finished the other window and a half in the sitting room, and was just going into the dining room to finish those windows. As she was washing those windows in the dining room, the prisoner again appeared from the front part of the house, went into the kitchen, got an ironing board, and began to iron her handkerchiefs. While there, she told Bridget this falsehood about a note. She said, "Are you going out, Bridget, by and by?" Bridget said, "I don't know, I'm not feeling very well today." "Well," she said, "if you do, I want you to be careful about the locks. I may go out myself. Mrs. Borden has gone out." "Where is she?" said Bridget. "I don't know. It must be somewhere in town because she received a note to go to a sick friend." Bridget finished the washing of the windows in the dining room, and her work was done. She went out into the kitchen, put her cloth away, emptied her water, and was about to go upstairs when the prisoner said to her, "There's a cheap sale of goods downtown, Bridget, where they're selling some kind of cloth at 8 cents a yard." Bridget said, "Well, I guess I will have some." And Bridget went upstairs. Now, gentlemen, probably all that occurred after Mr. Borden came in occurred in less time than perhaps it's taken me to tell it. We can measure time better by seeing what is done in the time than by the estimate of any witness of the time. After Bridget went upstairs, there was nothing more that happened until the alarm is given to her. Now, pursuing the same course, let me, so far as possible, fix the time of that alarm. I shall have to anticipate somewhat in doing it. Bridget, upon the alarm came downstairs, was immediately sent diagonally across the street for Dr. Bowen, returned rapidly, and was sent away for Miss Russell. As Bridget went away, Mrs. Churchill by accident came to the house, or got the alarm and came to the house. There was a moment's conversation between the prisoner and Mrs. Churchill. Mrs. Churchill ran out, ran diagonally across the street to a stable, there gave some sort of alarm, was seen by a man named Cunningham, who heard what she said and went to a telephone in a paint shop nearby. Telephoned the marshal of Fall River, who gave directions to an officer to go to the spot. The officer, having a duty which called his attention to the time, looked at his watch and found it was 11:15. Now then, gentlemen, stopping a moment, let us try to find out as well as we can these times. It could not have been, upon the evidence, far from 11:15 when Mr. Borden returned. It could not, upon the evidence, have been far from 11:15 when the alarm reached the station. Therefore, the time between Bridget's going upstairs and coming down again must be diminished on the one side by the time consumed by the washing of a window and a half in the sitting room and 2 windows in the dining room, and the putting away of the cloth and the water. On the other side of the half hour between 11 o'clock and 11:30 must be diminished by the acts of Bridget and the acts of Mrs. Churchill and the acts of Cunningham which I have described. I shall not attempt to fix that time. You can fix it better and measure it better yourselves when you come to hear the evidence of what was done by Bridget between the time Mr. Borden came and the noise was heard upstairs, and what was done between the time when the alarm took place and the alarm reached the station house and the marshal of Fall River. Now, gentlemen, you will be struck by the fact through the evidence that is to come that instinctively there leaped to the lips of every inquiring person of the prisoner. Where were you before the thought of suspicion was over her head? She had been the last person left with her father alive. When Bridget came down, that question arose. She says, "Where were you, Miss Lizzie?" It is not clear what the prisoner told Bridget, whether he was sick or killed or dead. That is not important. But the moment the information was received, arose the question, "Where were you?" She said, "I was out in the backyard. I heard a groan, came in, found the door open, and found my father." Bridget was then sent to Dr. Bowen. She came down, found the prisoner somewhat agitated, standing by the screen door inside. There had been no scream, no alarm of any kind. There was an attempt simply to secure the presence of Dr. Bowen. She came back unsuccessful from the search for Dr. Bowen. As she came back, she was seen by Mrs. Churchill, who, looking out her kitchen window, saw the prisoner standing inside the door, and something in her appearance attracted her, and she called out to her. In the meantime, the prisoner had said to Bridget, "You go down to Miss Russell's house." And gentlemen, it will in this connection occur to you that Miss Russell, though she lived a long distance away from this house, was the person to whom this prisoner was predicting disaster the very night before. Mrs. Churchill came there by accident, and she will testify in detail as to what occurred after she came there. She too said, "Lizzie, where were you?" "I was out in the barn. I was going for a piece of iron when I heard a distress noise. Came in, found the door open, found my father dead." Bridget returns from Miss Russell's, and returning says, "Shall I not go down to Mrs. Whitehead's for Mrs. Borden?" "No," says the prisoner. "I'm almost sure I heard her come in." Up to that time, by alarm, by screaming, or by any attempt, there had been no effort on the part of the prisoner to communicate with Mrs. Borden. "I wish you would look," she said, "and see if you can't find Mrs. Borden." Mrs. Churchill and Bridget together went up this front stairway, turned as they do to their left, and as they turned, Mrs. Churchill turned. She looked in and saw Mrs. Borden's dead body as she looked under the bed. It is to be regretted that Dr. Bowen, a witness accustomed to observation, was the family physician and friend, and therefore affected naturally by this dreadful series of murders. For we might expect from him something of an accurate observation, but Dr. Bowen thought Mrs. Borden had died of fright, and so expressed himself at the time. I do not and shall not attempt in detail to tell you all that occurred for the hour or two after the discovery of these homicides. Soon after, people came in. The prisoner, who had never been in the room where her father lay dead, passed from the dining room diagonally through the corner of the sitting room without stopping to look at her dead father, up the stairs by the room where her stepmother lay dead, without inquiry, without thought, went into her own room, lay down. Soon after, without a suggestion from anyone, changed her dress and put on a loose pink wrapper. She told Dr. Bowen at the time that she was out into the barn for a piece of iron. She told Mrs. Russell that she went out into the barn for a piece of iron or tin to fix a screen. She told Officer Mullally that she went out to the barn, and upon being asked whether she heard anything or not, she said she heard a peculiar noise, something like a scraping noise, and came in and found the door open. There is therefore Bridget Sullivan, to whom she said she heard a groan, rushed in and found her father. Mrs. Churchill, to whom she said she heard a distress noise, come in and found her father. Officer Mullally, to whom she said she heard a peculiar noise like a scraping, and come in and found her father dead. All of those, gentlemen, you see in substance are stories which include the fact that while she was outside, she heard some alarming noise which caused her to rush in and discover the homicide. Well, gentlemen, as the inquiry begins to multiply upon her as to her whereabouts, another story comes into view, and she repeats it again and again, and finally repeats it under oath, that at the time after Bridget went upstairs, she went out into the barn and into the loft of the barn to get lead to make sinkers. Now, gentlemen, having in view the character of her statements, that she heard the noise, you will find that when she gave a later and detailed account, she said that she went into the loft of the barn, opened the window, ate some pears there, and looked over some lead for sinkers, came down, looked into the stove to see if the fire was hot enough that she might go on with her ironing, found it was not, put her hat down, started to go upstairs to await the fire which Bridget was to build for noonday, and discovered her father. Is it not, gentlemen, and I pray your attention to it, a difference of words here? In the one case, the statement is that she was alarmed by the noise of the homicide. In the other case, the statement is that she came coolly and deliberately about her business, looking after her ironing, putting down her hat, and accidentally discovered the homicide as she went upstairs. Gentlemen, upon this point, it is my duty to point out to you a piece of testimony which will be for your consideration. This day, August 4th, 1892, was one of the hottest days of the last summer in this vicinity. The loft of the barn was almost stifling in the intensity of the heat. Officer Medley, who came there early after the alarm, went to the barn, went up the stairs of the barn. He had at that time heard of her going up into the loft, and as his head came up on a level with the floor of the barn, he saw that it was thickly covered in dust. He stopped, put his hands upon the floor and drew them across and saw the marks of them. He looked again, stepped up counting his footsteps upon a part of the barn floor, came down into his position again and saw plainly even footsteps which he made. I have said to you, gentlemen, that Mrs. Borden died some time before her husband, and it's my duty to open to you the proof upon that question. There will be many here who observe the two bodies as they lay in death. I shall not attempt to state their evidence in detail. I will tend to show that Mr. Borden's body showed freshly running blood, was warm and not rigid in death, and that Mrs. Borden's body showed blood that was coagulated and hardened and dry, that her body was cold, and she was stiffened in death. There will be judgments of some professional men who observed these two bodies soon after the discovery of the homicide. There will be other important testimony in this case. The stomachs of the two victims were taken to Professor Edward S. Wood, who examined them, and is prepared to state their exact contents. The stomach of Mrs. Borden contained 11 ounces of food in the process of digestion. 1/5 of that 11 ounces was water, and 4/5 was partially digested food. Mr. Borden's stomach, and you will remember that they ate breakfast at the same time, contained only 6 ounces of matter, 9/10 of that was water, and only 1/10 solid food. So you will see there was a very marked difference in the contents of their stomachs. Upon the autopsy, it appeared that the upper intestine leading directly from the stomach, the intestine in which the contents of the stomach first pass, in Mrs. Borden's case contained partially digested food. Mr. Borden's case was empty of food. It will appear the lower intestine of Mrs. Borden's case was empty. The food had not reached that stage of digestion. In Mr. Borden's case, that was the intestine which contained the breakfast as it had been digested. Now, gentlemen, it will appear that about the 2 rooms in which the homicides were committed, there was blood splattering in various directions. So that would make it probable 1 or more spatters of blood would be upon the person or upon the clothing of the assailant. And there has been produced for the inspection of the Commonwealth, it was produced a good many days after the homicide, the clothing said to have been worn by the prisoner on the morning of August 4th. The shoes, stockings, dress, and skirt. The most rigid examination by the most competent expert in the country fails to disclose any marks of blood upon the dress, which is produced as the one which she wore on the morning of the homicide, and upon the skirt which she is said to have worn upon that morning produces 1 minute spot of blood, which I do not think is worthwhile to call your attention to at the present time. I must go back a moment in this story. You have in mind, of course, the interval which elapsed between the 2 homicides. The prisoner had said, and it is important to consider, and we shall prove that she has said, that the reason she left her ironing is because she found the fire was low, that she took a stick of wood, put it on top of the embers of fire, and went out into the barn to await its kindling, that when she went out it was smoking and smoldering, as if it were going to catch, and that when she came back, the stick of wood was there, and the fire had all gone out. It will appear it was a pure accident this observation was made, that soon after the alarm an officer of Fall River was attracted by something that Dr. Bowen was doing to the stove. I do not mean to suggest anything, but the fact that he was tearing up a note and was going to put it in the stove. He looked in, saw what was there, and found a large roll of what appeared to be burnt paper. The prisoner had a calico or cotton dress, perhaps I ought to say, which she was in the habit of wearing in the mornings. It was a light blue dress with a fixed figure, a geometrical figure of some sort, and the figure was not white, but navy blue, a darker blue. Dr. Bowen has said, and I have no doubt will say here now, that she had on a cheap calico dress, a sort of drab-colored dress. Mrs. Churchill says she had on this morning, and Dr. Bowen's testified refers to this morning, that she had on this morning a light blue ground with white in it. That is, white and blue. Not a white figure, but white in the blue to make it a lighter blue, I suppose. And a fixed figure of navy blue without a white spot in it at all, a diamond figure of navy blue as she will describe it. And upon being shown that dress, she will say that it is not the dress that the prisoner at the bar had on when she came in upon the morning of the homicide. You will recall that soon after the homicide, Miss Russell and the prisoner went to the bedroom of the prisoner. While they were there, the prisoner said, "I think I'd better have Winwood for the undertaker." And Miss Russell went away upon the errand of getting Dr. Bowen to see about the undertaker. And as Miss Russell came back, she found the prisoner coming from Emma's room with the pink wrapper on that I have described to you before, the loose wrapper. Upon Saturday night, the chief executive officer of the city of Fall River, Mayor Coughlin, informed Lizzie Andrew Borden that she was under suspicion for these murders. Saturday night, Bridget Sullivan left the house. Alice Russell was staying with her friend, and of course, Miss Emma was at home at that time. On the morning of Sunday, Miss Russell came into the kitchen. There were officers about on the outside of the house, but none in. And there was the prisoner with the skirt of a dress upon her arm, and what appeared to be its waist lying upon some shelf by the side, and we will describe that dress. It was a dress which the prisoner had purchased in the spring of that year, a cotton dress, and not a silk dress like this. It was a light blue dress. You will recall Mrs. Churchill's description of that in this connection. It was a light blue dress with a fixed navy blue spot in it. This dress, ordinarily worn in the morning, corresponds to the description and was also bought in the spring. As she saw the prisoner standing by the stove, and as she approached her, Miss Emma turned around and said, "Lizzie, what are you going to do?" The prisoner replied, "I am going to burn this dress. It is all covered with paint." Miss Russell turned away. She came in again to the room, and she found the prisoner standing with the waist of the light blue dress, apparently tearing it in parts, and she said, "Lizzie, I would not do that where people can see you." The only response which the prisoner made was to take a step or two further out of observation. Miss Russell turned again and went away. Upon the following day, in consequence of some talk with Mr. Hanscom, a Pinkerton detective not in the employ of the government, Miss Russell went into the room where the prisoner and her sister Emma were sitting and said, "Lizzie, I'm afraid the burning of that dress was the worst thing you could have done." She said, "Oh, why did you let me do it then?" A considerable search had been made by the officers for clothing and for weapons. They will say that the search was such that no clothing, unconcealed, covered with paint, could have escaped their observation. You have noticed, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen, that this indictment states that these homicides were committed with a sharp cutting instrument, a more particular description of which is to the jurors unknown. It is the duty of the government to bring forward all its information upon this subject, and I propose to open it all to you at the present time. Upon the premises that day were found 2 hatchets and 2 axes. Upon one of those hatchets, spots were discovered, which upon view were thought to be blood. It is extremely difficult, impossible in fact, Dr. Wood, the highest authority on the subject in this country, if not the world, will say, to distinguish between blood and some other substances. Attention upon the view then was directed to one of these hatchets, it's not important which. It is said to be the one I hold in my right hand. These axes, gentlemen, are so far out of the question that I need not waste any time on them. They could not have been the weapons with which these homicides were committed. Upon careful examination, neither of these hatchets is seen to contain the slightest evidence of bloodstain. The appearances which were thought to be blood turned out to be something else. You will observe, gentlemen, that there are ragged pieces near and about the entrance of the handle to the blade of this hatchet, that the same appearances that exist there in that weapon are also on the outside of the handle. Dr. Wood will say that those weapons could not, in all probability, have been used for these homicides, and have been washed so as to have prevented the traces of blood from being caught on those ragged surfaces. In that view of the fact, we may as well lay those weapons aside as entirely innocent. Upon the day of the homicide, another weapon, or part of a weapon, was found after what was thought to be a bloody hatchet had been discovered and attracted little attention. It was seen by one officer and left where it was. At that time, this fragment of handle was in its appropriate place at the helve, if that is the proper name of the hatchet, in the place where it fitted in the head. It was covered with an adhesion of ashes, not the fine dust which floats about the room where ashes are emptied, but a coarse dust of ashes adhering more or less to all sides of the hatchet. Upon the Monday morning, this hatchet was taken away, and its custody from that time to the present will be traced. You will observe, gentlemen, that both hatchets are rusty. The hatchet which is innocent, the handleless hatchet now under discussion, but the rust in the case of the handleless hatchet is uniform upon both sides and upon all parts of its surface. Such rust, for instance, as might be the result of exposure upon a wet grass to a night's dew. Such rust as must result from an exposure uniform in its extent upon all parts of the hatchet. Professor Wood will say to you he saw this hatchet soon after it was found, that while there were ragged fragments of wood which would detain absolutely no indications of the blood in these other weapons, that if that weapon had upon it the remainder of its hatchet and was as smooth as he saw, By the application of water soon after the homicide, blood could be readily, effectually, and completely removed. Dr. Wood will also tell you that the break, which had not the color then which it has now, it has been subjected to some acid process, was a new break, and was a fresh break. By that, I do not mean to be understood as a break which had necessarily occurred within 24 hours, within 48 hours, or within a week. Perhaps a break that might have been a day or might have been a month old. It was a fresh break. In accordance, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen, with the unbroken practice of the authorities in this Commonwealth, such parts of the mortal remains of the victims as would tend to throw light either in the protection of the innocents or the detection of guilt have been preserved and must be presented here before your consideration. I do not think it's necessary for me to allude to them at this time. There is one story that is unmistakably told by those skulls and by the chipping blows that are upon them, and that is that the weapon which produced them was a sharp weapon. There is another thing that is unmistakably told by one of the skulls, I think that of Mr. Borden, and that is that the weapon which brought him to his death was just 3½ inches on its blade, no more, no less. That is the exact measurement of the blade of that hatchet. Let there be no mistake, Mr. Foreman and gentlemen, about my meaning. The government does not insist that these homicides were committed by this handleless hatchet. It may have been the weapon. It may well have been the weapon. The one significant fact, which in this respect is emphasized, is that the bloody weapon was not found by the sides of the victim upon the premises or near them. Doubtless, you will consider the fact well when you come to consider whether these homicides were the act of an intruder or a stranger flying from his crimes with the bloody weapon in his possession throughout the streets of Fall River at noonday, or the acts of an intimate of the house, familiar with its resources for destruction, obliteration, and concealment. When these bodies were found, it was discovered that not a thing in the house had been disturbed. No property had been taken. No drawers had been ransacked. Mr. Borden had upon his person a considerable sum of money, as well as his watch and chain. We almost might hope that it was not necessary to include another motive, but sad experience tells us that age of a woman is no protection from an assault from a lustful purpose. But I may say, gentlemen, that there was nothing to indicate a motive of that sort. In and about the rooms where the two homicides were committed, there was not the slightest evidence of a struggle. The assailant, whoever he or she may have been, was able to approach each victim in broad daylight, and without a struggle, without a murmur, to lay them low before them. Mrs. Borden was found prostrated between the bureau and the bed, her face upon the floor, the right side of her head hacked to pieces by blows, some of great force, some of uncertain and vacillating weakness. Mr. Borden was found reclining on a sofa in the sitting room, and apparently had passed from life to death without a struggle or a movement. And his head, too, bore the same marks as the head of his wife bore. It will appear to no one, and it is confirmatory evidence, not in itself of the strongest character, but confirmatory of the conclusive evidence of the opportunity in the house. It will appear that no one was seen to escape from any side of the house, nor to enter that house on the morning of August 4th. Gentlemen, let me stop a moment and see where we are. The Commonwealth will prove that there was an unkindly feeling between the prisoner and her stepmother, that upon Wednesday, August 3rd, she was dwelling upon murder and preparing herself with weapons which had no innocent use, that upon the evening of Wednesday, August 3rd, she was predicting disaster and cataloging defenses, that from the time when Mrs. Borden left the dining room to go upstairs for this momentary errand, up to the time when the prisoner came downstairs an hour later from this hallway, which led only to her chamber, and that in which Mrs. Borden was found, there was no other human being, except the prisoner at the bar, present. That these acts were the acts of a human being, that they were the acts of a person who, to have selected a time and place as it was selected in this case, must have had a familiar knowledge of the interior of the premises, and the whereabouts, and the habits of those who were in occupation of them at the time. We shall prove that this prisoner made contradictory statements about her whereabouts, and, above all, gave a statement vitally different upon the manner in which she discovered these homicides. We shall prove beyond all reasonable doubt that this death of Mrs. Borden was a prior death. Then we shall ask you to say, if say you can, whether any other reasonable hypothesis except that of the guilt of this prisoner can account for the sad occurrences which happened on the morning of August 4th. Now, gentlemen, my present duty is drawing to a close. The time for idle rumor, for partial and insufficient evidence, for hasty and inexact reasoning is past. We are to be guided from this time forth by the law and the evidence only. I conjure you to keep your minds in that same open and receptive condition in which you have sworn they were. I pray you keep them so to the end. If, when that end comes, after you have heard the evidence upon both sides, the arguments of counsel, the instructions of the court, the evidence fails, God forbid that you should step one step against the law or beyond the evidence to the injury of this prisoner. But if your minds, considering all these circumstances, are led irresistibly to the conclusion of her guilt, we ask you in your verdict to declare the truth, and by doing so, and only by doing so, shall you make true deliverance of the great issue which has been committed to your keeping.
At 10:55, at the conclusion of Mr. Moody's opening, a recess was taken. The jury returned to the courtroom shortly after 11 o'clock. The government calls its first witness, Thomas Kieran. Mr. Kieran is sworn in and takes the witness stand. Direct examination of the witness by William H. Moody of the prosecution.
Your full name, sir?
Thomas Kieran.
You are by profession an engineer?
Yes, sir.
And I believe city engineer of Fall River?
No, sir.
At the request of the government, you made some surveys and plans.
Yes, sir.
How far is it from the Borden house to the central police station, going the direct way through the streets?
I measured that distance, sir, and gave the notes to Mr. Knowlton this morning. Those are the notes. From the Borden house to the central police station is about 1,300 feet.
How far is it from the Borden house to City Hall?
About 900 feet.
How far is it from the central police station to the northern police station?
About 6,025 feet, or 1 mile and 14 1/100ths.
Is there any difference in distance between the distance from City Hall to the northern station and the distance from City Hall to the central station?
Yes, sir.
And in which way is that difference?
The City Hall is about 150 feet further from the northern station than the central police station is from the northern station.
He did not exactly answer your question. I do not care to object.
Which is the lesser distance?
From the central police station to the northern station is the lesser distance.
You have drawn, Mr. Witness, a plan of Main, 2nd, Borden, Spring, and Rodman streets, or parts of those streets, including City Hall, Post Office, and some of the adjoining streets?
I had that plan made in my office. I verified the distances myself on it.
The plan depicting Main, 2nd, Borden, Spring, and Rodman Street is marked Exhibit 1.
Are these distances indicated upon Plan Number 1 correctly stated upon the plan, so far as they are stated?
Yes, sir.
The scale of the plan is 50 feet to an inch?
Yes, sir.
Will you tell me the distance indicated on this plan from the store now occupied by Jonathan Clegg on Main Street to Mr. Borden's house, passing from Main Street through Spring Street and then north to the Borden house?
I should have to scale it from the plan in order to tell you.
If you can do that readily, I wish you would do so.
It's about 540 feet.
Counsel addresses the jury.
That is the store now occupied by Mr. Clegg, and passing south up Main Street, then turning to the left and going down Spring Street. Then turning to the left, going north and downhill, you come to the Borden house. and the distance between those two places is what the witness has stated. Have you absolutely correct measure, Mr. Witness?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Moody compares two sets of plans with the witness.
Will you see if that is, or will you let us have that?
Both of those are supposed to be standard measures?
Have you drawn a plan showing the Borden premises and the surrounding premises upon its three sides?
Yes, sir.
And is that the plan?
Yes, sir.
Unless I hear some objection, I will go on. Are the measurements on this plan correct?
So far as I know, yes, sir.
Did you make them yourself?
Yes, sir.
What is the scale of this plan?
This is 8 feet to 1 inch.
The plan depicting the Borden premises and surrounding premises is marked Exhibit 2.
I don't think, gentlemen, it will be necessary to delay with this at present. Have you drawn a plan of the Borden premises themselves?
Yes, sir.
And the scale upon which that plan is drawn?
4 feet to 1 inch.
Are the measurements and drawings upon this plan correct?
So far as I know, they are.
You drew them yourself? You made them yourself?
Yes, sir.
The plan depicting the first floor of the Borden premises is marked Exhibit 3.
This plan contains upon it, and as part of it, the interior of the house upon the ground floor. Are those measurements also correct?
Yes, sir.
And the scale is the same?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you, what is the height of the first story of that house?
I have measured it and marked it on the plan.
Well, I want you to state it, please. Use that to refresh your memory.
The first story?
Yes, the first story.
8 feet and 10 inches from the plastering down to the carpet.
What is the height of the second story of that building?
8 feet and 4 inches.
Have you drawn a plan, similar to the last in every respect, except that the second story of the house is indicated on the plan instead of the first?
Yes, sir.
And are the measurements on that plan correct?
So far as I know, they are.
And the scale is what?
4 feet to 1 inch.
And on this plan there is a red indication. That means where the carpet is now cut out, does it not?
That means where the carpet was cut on the day I made the measurements.
That is in the guest chamber?
Yes, sir.
The plan depicting the second floor of the Borden premises is marked Exhibit 4.
Mr. Witness, on this plan showing the second story, it would appear as if steps were indicated. There is no such thing on the second story.
There are no steps.
That apparent indication of steps is to show the relative position of the steps to the room upstairs.
This is a plan which shows the grounds surrounding the house, but shows the second story of the interior of the house.
Is this a plan of the interior of the sitting room of the house?
Yes, sir.
And what is the scale of that plan?
That is 1 inch to 1 foot.
It is indicated in the plan?
Yes, sir.
The plan depicting the interior of the sitting room is marked Exhibit 5.
Are these blueprint duplicates, so far as they go, of the plans which are in the case?
Of those parts of them?
Of those parts of the two rooms?
Yes, sir.
Blueprint of downstairs is marked Exhibit 6. The blueprint of upstairs is marked Exhibit 7. Mr. Moody completed his examination, cross-examination of the witness by Andrew Jennings of the defense.
Is this plan drawn by you?
This is a blueprint I made from a plan which I drew.
Are the measurements on that correct?
So far as I know, they are, yes, sir.
What does that represent?
This shows the Andrew Borden house and lot. There is the Buffington house just north of it, and Dr. Kelly's house and lot and sheds just south of it, and Dr. Chagnon's house just to the eastward of it, and the Buffington house.
Have you stated that it represents the Bowen and Miller house?
I did not so state. It does so contain them.
It is a double house, isn't it?
I presume so. I've never been inside of it, but I think so from the appearance of it outside.
What do these front projections on the Bowen Miller house represent?
There are 2 bay windows, square bay windows on the front, and between those are the steps to the piazza. In front of those 2 steps are 2 gates and a short walk that leads up to each flight of steps, and those lead to the 2 front doors.
Now, have you made any experiments or tests to see what the line of vision is in passing up 2nd Street or down 2nd Street by the Borden house relative to the barn door on the south side of the barn?
Yes, sir.
What was the result of your experiments?
If a man stands on 2nd Street and brings his eye...
If you can please step down so the jury can see. This is 2nd Street?
This is 2nd Street.
West of the house?
West of the house, yes.
Now, you said, if a man stood upon 2nd Street at a point
South of the house, and brought his eye directly in a line drawn past the corner of Dr. Kelly's house...
Which corner?
The northwest corner. And the southeast corner of Andrew Borden's house. If his eye was in direct continuation of that line on 2nd Street, he could see the 12 inches of the barn door of the Andrew Borden barn.
Would it be the hinge side or the latch side?
That I should want to refer to my notes before answering. Shall I do so?
Yes, if they want it.
The witness was suspended until the following morning at 9 a.m. The plan last referred to was marked Exhibit 8.
At our own desire, and also at the desire of the learned counsel for the defense, who are as anxious as we are that everything connected with this tragedy should be seen by the jury, I now move that the jury be directed to take the view of not only the interior, but exterior of the house, and of such other points as to which there will be testimony, as counsel may be able to agree that the jury shall see.
I would say on behalf of the defendant that this has been a subject of conference and we cheerfully join in it. We should have made the same request to the court if the government had not made it. I would suggest that while, of course, the defendant is entitled to accompany the jury, she does not desire to go and does not really feel able to take this excursion this afternoon for that purpose, and we waive all her rights, I say this in her presence and with her consent, to any participation in the view.
The court, in ordering the view, desire to be distinctly understood that if the defendant desires to be present at the view, she may be permitted to be present. She will not be required to be if she does not desire to be.
I have made her fully informed of the situation, and that is her wish.
The officers were then sworn to accompany the jury upon the view.
I desire to say to the jury a single word. This view is not at all the purpose of receiving any testimony at the view. You are only to observe the physical objects that shall be called to your attention. Counsel will not be at liberty to address you in any other way than to call your attention to the objects which you are desired to observe. It will not be proper for you to ask questions of counsel with reference to anything that is seen. Testimony will reference all that you will see will be given here upon the stand, and you are to keep together.
All of you are to see everything that any of you see. You are not to separate at all to make independent observations individually, but you, as a jury, will see all that is called to your attention. You will observe the strict oath which the officers have taken, and you will be exceedingly careful that no others address than those officers that have permission to allow to address you. And when the view is completed, you will return to the officers and come into court at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. The officers now will suffer the jury to obtain luncheon before leaving upon the train. The court will remain open, and the court will take a recess.
The court recessed. The jury, accompanied by counsel from the state and defense, departed to view various pertinent locations in Fall River, most notably the scene of the murders. The Lizzie Borden trial, Day 2. Featured Keith Morrison as William H. Moody, Dan Roy as Thomas Kieran, Christine Daniels as George Robinson, Ian Morrison as Andrew J. Jennings, Mark Penny as Hosea Knowlton, Kevin Morrison as Chief Justice Mason, Colleen McIsaac as the court clerk. This production was produced by Lions Den Theatre. For more information about Lions Den, find us at facebook.com/lionsdentheatre or Twitter @lionsdentheatre. Or feel free to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm your Day 2 announcer, Jen Tubbard. Stay healthy, stay happy, and stay safe.